This session, Knowledge Share 5, is on fees and funding. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you about fees, and then I'm going to pass over to Rachel to do funding. So before I get into the fields that we collect, just a quick overview of where they sit within the data model. So we have the engagement entity. Each student will have at least one engagement to record their time at a provider. There are a couple of fields held at this level about the student's fee eligibility and status, but the majority of fields related to fees sit on the student course session. So this is where we're recording a year of the student's activity. So we have some fields about the level of fees that they're being charged, some information about the source of those fees, and then an additional field as well that sits on the module instance related to fees. But I will go through each of those in more detail. I'm going to start off with those this module instance fee field and the student course session fee field to say how they work together. So those two fields, the module instance fee and the student course session fee, both record the fees before any discounts or waivers have been taken into account. So as the name suggests, the student course session fee is recording that fee for the student course session, the module instance for that fee for that given module instance. And as this one is the fee before any discounts or waivers, it's a similar concept to what we have in our current collection, the gross fee field. The way that it works differently is because we have those fields at the two different levels. So I'll run through how that works. Providers have the option to return the fees in three different ways. So they can return one fee for each student course session. If they charge their fees on a yearly basis, that's probably how they're going to return that. Each student course session just gets one student course session fee. Alternatively, they can return one fee for each module instance. And the third option is to return a mix of the two. The key thing being that fees must not be double counted. So if they do return a mix of the two, it has to genuinely be because both sets of fees exist and therefore it's not double counting to return both. But I'll run through an example to show how that works. Method one then, return the fee for the full student course session. So like I said, this is straightforward. Each student course session would have a fee returned, and if the provider's charging on a yearly basis, they're going to know the fee for that student course session. They can return that in each reference period that the student course session spans. So quite straightforward. Each student course session, the provider tells us how much the fee is for that session. The second one then, return the fee for each module instance. This is more likely to be used if the provider charges fees on a modular basis. The reason being that if students are charged per module, and potentially at the start of a student course session, the provider might not know how many modules a student's going to take up during that student course session. So when they first return that student course session, they may not know the particular fee that is going to be charged, and so they can't return that student course session fee field. So what they do instead is for each module that the student studies, the fee for that module is returned. So module one might have a fee of £500, and then for each module that the student studies during that student course session, the fee is returned to build up that picture of the student course session of what the student has been charged. And we can then add those all together at the end to get the full fee for the student course session. So the full fee for student course session 1 was £9,250, and the full fee for student course session 2, when we add them all together, we've got £3,150. So in both examples, at the end of the student course session, we will know how much was charged, but it's accounting for the different approaches that different providers might have. The third approach, as I said, is to record a mix. So recording both the student course session fee amount and also the module instance fee amount. And the reason that we've given this as an option, we had some examples from a provider where they charged one kind of flat fee for the student course session, but additionally they charged on a modular basis depending on how many modules a student signed up for in a given year. So they needed to be able to return this fee at the student course session level because it wasn't attributable to a given module, so it needs to sit here, but they also need to return fees at a module level because that's how they charge their fees, and so wouldn't have the overall value for a student course session to return in this field. And so in that situation, they can return both a student course session fee and a student module fee because students genuinely being charged both. So as I said, they'd have a student course session fee returned to say how much was being charged for that fee for that year. And as with method 2, for every module the student studies, they would have a module instance fee returned as well. And so when we are deriving the total fee for that student course session, we're going to take into account the student course session fee and each module fee to get the total amount for that student course session. Now, as I've said a couple of times, it's important that we're not double counting. So we want to make sure that a provider isn't unintentionally returning all these module fees and then repeating that in a student course session fee, making the fees look higher than they are. And that's where this field fee method comes into play. So if they are using option 3 and returning a mix of student course session fees and module fees, they need to return this fee method field to say, yep, that's right, we're returning a mix of different fees. And that's confirming to us that the provider's confirming that that's not double counting. That is the method that we're using to record our fees. So those are the 3 methods then for returning that full fee before any discounts or waivers. They can return 1 for the student course session as a whole, they can return 1 for each module instance, or a mix of both, and then we will get to that full fee for the student course session. But we also want to know what is the fee that they were charged after those discounts or waivers were taken into account, and that's where the invoice fee amount comes into play. So this, we have 1 fee recorded for each student course session to say what was the fee for that student course session after those waivers or discounts have been taken into account. And because of that, we therefore expect the invoice fee amount to be less than or equal to the combined total of all of those student course session and module fee amounts I've spoken about previously. So again, as with the previous ones being a similar concept to gross fee in the current return, this is recording the fee after any discounts or waivers. So it's similar to the net fee concept in our current HESA collections. Along with that field on the student course session, we also want some information about the source of that fee. So who is paying those fees? So we also have an Invoice HESAID field that sits on the student course session, recording the source of the tuition fees. In most cases, it's the major source of the fees, so who's paying the majority of the fees. We're just recording one organisation in this field, so it's who paid the majority. There are a couple of exceptions to that, where there's a particular rule that we've got based on the information that we need. So if there's a split between the student paying the fees and the remainder coming from the student loans company, then we want the student loans company to be returned. But if there is a split between the student loans company and another source, whoever that might be, the other source should be returned, because we'd know from the SSN student support number that's been returned that the student has SLC funding. And finally, if fees paid by the student is only returned when the student pays the full fees. So even if they pay the majority of their fees, if there is another source, then that's the source that we're interested in. We only want to record that they're paying their fees if they're paying the lot themselves. And as with the other fields, this also has similar counterpart in our current collection. So we have our major source of tuition fees field in the current return, and this is largely equivalent to that. So we've got the amount that the student is charged before any discounts or waivers are taken into account. We've got how much they're charged after any of those discounts or waivers, and then we've got a bit of information about who it is that's paying that fee. For providers in Wales, we have a little bit more information about who's paying the fee. So we have the employee fees field for part-time students in Wales that records if the student's employer pays the fees in whole or in part. So because this field is only recording the majority source, it's not possible from this alone to definitively say whether the employee has any contribution, because they may be a minor source and so not recorded here. And that's why we need this additional field to cover the requirement in Wales to record if the student's employer is contributing to those tuition fees. To clarify how fees work in relation to reference periods then, student course session will likely span several reference periods. Module instances may span reference periods as well. The basic rule is that the fees returned where the entity that it relates to exists in the current reference period. So we'd expect to see that fee returned each reference period where it's relevant. We've also recently confirmed some guidance around module instances, that once a module instance has been returned for a student course session, it must continue to be returned until that student course session has ended. So even if the module instance has ended, continue to return that module instance until the end of the student course session. I'll give you an example to demonstrate that. So in this example, we've got a provider using method 3 to return that fee for the student course session and modules before the discounts or waivers have been taken into account. So they've got one fee for the student course session as a whole that's spanning 3 different reference periods. And then they've also got a fee for each module that the student is engaging with. So in each reference period, they're going to return the fees for the student course session and module instances that span that reference period. So in reference period 1, they're returning the fee for the student course session, and then the fees for modules A, B, and F, because they fall into that reference period. In RP2, we're still going to have the fee for the student course session because it's spanning into there. We're also going to have the fees for modules A, B, and C. They fall within that reference period. But because of that rule I said about continuing to return a module instance, we're also going to have module F included in there. So we're building up a picture of all the modules across the student course session. Even though this one's ended, it's continuing to be returned in this reference period. So that by the end of the student course session in RP3, we've still got that student course session fee returned, and we have got all of the modules that the students engaged with as part of that student course session returned. So they're all included and returned in that final reference period. What you may have noticed is that module F here is marked as being the second half of a module, meaning that it started in the previous student course session, and it's a continuation of that module from a previous student course session. It would therefore have the continuing module field returned to show that it started in a previous student course session and is continuing into this one. And what that means is it makes sure that we're not double counting this fee for that module because we know it's been counted before. So when it comes to deriving the full fee for this student course session, we're going to take into account the 500 for the student course session itself and all of the modules fees there except for module F. So we're not going to take into account the fee for module F because we've already counted this fee in a previous student course session, and we know that due to that continuing module field that was returned. I'm just going to pause there before I move on to the fields at the engagement level to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we've got one in so far.
Okay.
Are there any credibility checks for fee levels that relate to the maximum fees that can be charged? For example, anything that would check that the maximum fee for a part-time year doesn't go over the fee limits?
Yes, I think. Oh, do you want to?
I was going to say, we've just published a whole bunch of rules last week, kind of the draft rules, and they are some of those included. So there are some around part-time, there's some around the maximum fee levels in terms of what was the offer financial stuff checks that we had in there. Those equivalents are in there. So if you go and have a look, so far, those are the ones that we think are kind of copied over from student record at the moment. We think we've captured the ones, all the ones that you might need, but if there's anything else, then do let us know. Sorry, carry on, Ruth.
That's all right. Thanks, Rachel. I didn't realise we published them, so that's useful.
Yeah, I looked at them last week, so I thought I'd jump in there.
Thanks. Was there anything else, Laura?
No, it's just that one in so far. Thank you.
Great, thanks. The final bit that I was going to cover then is a couple of fields that sit at the engagement level, recording fee eligibility and status. So for those of you familiar with the current return, you'll know we have the fee eligibility field. We've sort of split that out slightly into these two fields. So fee eligibility still exists for England, Northern Ireland and Wales, but we've got a slightly different requirement for Scotland. So we have the fee status field in Scotland, and I'll just run through the difference is there. So in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we're interested in whether the students are eligible to pay home fees. So it's, are they eligible, they're not eligible, or was eligibility not assessed? There is a different requirement in Scotland related to breaking out the difference between home tuition fees and the rest of the UK tuition fees, which is why we've got this in a separate field due to that different requirement. So here we're interested in whether they're home tuition fees, rest of the UK or overseas, or again, not assessed. And the other difference between these is that final valid entry, both of the fields have got that fee eligibility not assessed value, but the guidance around the use of that is again slightly different between the two. I'm going to put it on the screen, but I'm not expect you to read all of it. The gist is that in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, that valid entry shouldn't be used just because the provider does not have different fees for home and overseas students. So what we're interested in here is about the student's eligibility rather than the way that a provider structures their fees. So it's about the student rather than the provider's fee structure. And there are a couple of examples of when it might be used. So in there, it's got incoming exchange students. It can be used in that case. Different approach in Scotland, as I said, and where it can be returned, where every student pays the same fee. So if there's no differentiation based on the student's circumstances, then that's when fee eligibility not assessed would be used. So like I said, different approach there between the two fields. In England, Northern Ireland and Wales, it shouldn't be used based on the fee structure of the provider, but in Scotland, it should be used where there's no differentiation based on the student's circumstances. And those are the fields within the model that collect fee information. So just to summarize again, we've got those last two fields I spoke about sit on the engagement, recording the student's fee eligibility and status, status being for providers in Scotland. We've then got a few fields that collect information about the student's fees before any discounts or waivers are taken into account. So that's the student course session amount field, the module instance amount field. And when those two are used together as part of the same student course session, we have that fee method field. So providers can confirm that that's correct and they're not double counting. And then we have these fields here, which are about the amount that the student actually was charged and was paid. So after any discounts or waivers are taken into account. And then in relation to that fee, we want to know, in most cases, what's the major source? And for providers in Wales, is the student's employer contributing towards that for part-time students?
Oh, bear with me. Would it be possible to work out the total amount of fees charged in a particular time period, such as the August to July academic year?
So the fees aren't broken down by reference period, and they're broken down by student course session or module. So in order to do that, you would have to divide the fee by, depending on the length of the student course session and the period of time that you're interested in. If it spans that period, you would have to derive that. And so you would need to make a kind of assumption that that fee is evenly split across that period of time. But you would be able to do something to get close to that, if that answers the question.
Brill, thank you. I'm sure they'll clarify again if they need anything else answering. Otherwise, I think that was the only question we had in for that bit.
So yes, I'm going to talk to you about funding and some of the fields that we have in the model around funding.